I spent the last few days doing research and just looking up information on language acquisition. Then I stumbled upon a teacher called James Marvin Brown, who spent like his whole life looking for the best way to teach language, in particular Thai. Now those students had been studying for a little over a year, whereas he had been living in Thailand for decades. And he wrote all of this down in a book. So in this video I'm going to summarize this book and I'll tell you what Brown found out about language, what method he developed, what problems he found, and how he solved these problems with an equation called LG, a term that might sound familiar. And at the end I'll share my experience with my first online class of Thai that I had. It was a pretty interesting class. So to start off with, this is Brown's opinion on language. Language is not something we learn. It is something that we experience. Brown says he had an experience where his Chinese teacher fell flat on the ground when she was trying to ride a bicycle. And she was all embarrassed and she cried, "Don't look at me," in Chinese of course. And to this day, even 54 years later, he can still hear those words in his head. This experience is still in his head. Now this gets a little complicated and I'm not sure if I fully understand it, but I'm going to try and draw this. So language is part of an experience, and each experience is like a neural tree in your brain that grows and is connected with strings. For example, when you dip a donut into your coffee, that's part of your breakfast experience and part of other experiences with donuts, and this is connected by strings. Now when we think, these circuits light up and a spark travels on the circuit. And when this spark travels to another tree, you might say, "Hey, I remember this," or "Hey, this reminds me of." Now you can apply this to acquiring language as well. For example, when you think of a bird, the whole bird's circuit starts to light up. And now you can see in an instant all the experiences you had with birds. Or I should say where this word bird was involved. So the word is like the circuit, and the meaning is all of these trees, all of these experiences that you had. So when you acquire a language, all of these circuits light up in a fraction of a second. Whereas when you try to actively learn a language, or when you try to memorize a word I should say, you have to manually look in every tree to find the word you're looking for, and this takes much more time. Brown also said that during his life, over and over, he found that people who were experiencing the language had way better results than people who were trying to learn and ask questions about the language. Some people even became better at Thai than him in a shorter period of time. Now there's one example in a book that I really like that summarizes all of this basically. So a student of English can't really learn the meaning of the word book by literally translating it. Not in the sense of language acquisition at least. He cannot acquire it naturally if you fake the experience, like holding up a book and saying, "This is a book." Because like the reason for this experience or this happening, as Brown calls them, is missing. There's no why or how, or there's nothing with the experience that happened. Now compare this with a student who is going into a post office with you. Now you're bringing a book with you and you want to send the book to someone else. And it happened to be that there's a special discount for books. And so now when you say, "Oh well, this is a book," there's a real experience right there. Because it has all the W questions. The who, the what, the why, etc. What? The special book you were sending to a friend. When? The day after you had told your friend about it on the phone. Where? In the post office, near your office. Why? To get the book rate. And these who, what, why, where are all part of this whole experience. So this is how we acquire language according to Brown. And when he discovered this, he had to implement this into the classroom, which was his next challenge. Now at some point in his life, Brown had received the book The Natural Approach by Stephen Krashen, which he was already kind of familiar with. He received it from a colleague of his. And when he read that, he had a sudden conversion, a realization. Now I explained the theory of this book in another video that you can watch. It's kind of essential, but to cover the basics briefly, Krashen says we acquire language when we understand the message through comprehensible input that we understand. There's no speaking, at least not in the beginning, because speaking emerges automatically when you're ready. So anyway, after he got the book, he had a sudden realization. Now he had to create a class using the theory of this book. And when he did so, the students actually loved it. But it also occurred to him that maybe the students weren't receiving real Thai. So he thought, what if I brought someone else with me, a partner who speaks real Thai, and I can tell them, "Look, I speak the same Thai. My Thai is as good as hers." Now this turned out to be a great step into the development of his method, because now he had two teachers instead of one. And it never occurred to him to have two teachers. So eventually Brown and the colleague that gave him this book developed a method, and eventually the method became so different to the natural approach method by Stephen Krashen that they wrote their own book called The Listening Approach. Now fast forward a bit and he encountered a few problems. Now like I said, Stephen Krashen says there's a period, the silent period, where children don't speak a language. They just acquire the language and in the brain it's being processed, but they don't speak yet. This period can last for a few months, but Brown thought it would be better to extend this silent period and have the students not speak at all for hundreds of hours. So he told his colleague teachers that the students should not speak at all. But still, they tried to speak. So then he put up signs in the classroom that said, "Don't speak any Thai." But still, the students would try to speak Thai. So he gave up on the signs and he just told the students instead, "Don't speak Thai in the class." But still, they tried to speak Thai. And so he found that convincing the world that not speaking at the beginning is really hard. Which I agree, it's really hard to convince people to try another method when speaking from the start is something that people still to this day try. It is just the way people like to learn language. Now 15 years later, the school had more than hundreds of students who had more than 1,000 hours of just input. Some of these students did speak and some of the students did not speak. Now he found also that some non-speakers passed him, but also some speakers passed him. So what was going on here? It seemed as if something else besides speaking was causing the students damage. Up until now, Brown's course consisted of 4 rules, I guess. And notice how similar these are to children who are acquiring a language. The minimal unit of natural learning is an interesting experience or a happening. The non-speaking part of this happening should carry most of the meaning. There should be 2 or more teachers talking throughout the happening. The students should be involved in the happening without speaking. The students' attention should be on the happening, not the teacher talk. Now Brown found that there was actually another reason why he wasn't getting the results he wanted from the students who weren't speaking. And he found a solution to this problem after he had an experience himself. You see, Brown loved languages and he had the idea to learn Swato or Shanto Chinese, I don't know exactly what the name is. And he had 2 colleague teachers who were raised in Swato Chinese. So he used one of those teachers to help him learn the language. So a few years later, he decided that it would be a good idea if the teacher brought in a friend who also spoke the same language. And so he listened to the 2 teachers talk to each other, complain about children and their husbands and whatever. But he also found out that because he was a lifetime linguist, he couldn't help himself noticing certain things in the language. For example, in 2 days, he found out that the language had 5 tones, and syllables ending in a sudden stop like k or t could only carry high or low tones. And after 5 weeks, he couldn't stop noticing even other things. And this is the problem that Brown had found. Thinking is preventing the students from learning the language, at least learning it the right way. And this took such a long time to figure out because you cannot see what students are thinking. So he figured the next step would be to measure the way students were learning. And this is where his equation comes in. Now traditionally, teachers test the results of students by testing them, right? Now Brown called this artificial testing. And he wanted to find a way to measure real results. Because if you look at toddlers, for example, you don't test them if you want to figure out how well they speak the language. You just ask them how old they are. So all Brown had to do was find out the age of their students. And after a while of doing this, he actually got pretty good at figuring out the level of certain students according to their age. He started to get a feeling for how well 200 hours, 400 hours or 600 hours students were doing. And eventually he could even start to match toddler months with student hours. So for example, 600 hours of input produced a similar results to a toddler who was 24 months old. Now this is of course for English speakers learning Thai. If an English speaker were to learn French, it would be a lot less because the similarities and So the next step was to create a formula that had the amount of hours and that would give them a certain result, a grade. So he said grade 0 for a total beginner and grade 100 for a native speaker. Now his equation or his graph, the formula, it would look something like this. It starts to bend as it reaches 100, but the question is how fast would it bend or how fast can we acquire? Now Brown has studied physics for a while and I'm not really great at physics, so I'm going to try and explain this, but it's kind of complicated. At first, the formula, it was a great start, but it needed some fine-tuning. For example, he could put in the amount of hours that students had class, but this is not exactly the same as hours of comprehensible input. When I have 1 hour of class, it could be that only 30 minutes of that input I actually understood. So he started asking the students and the teachers how much of the class they actually understood, what percentage of the class they actually understood. Now, students could have multiple teachers, so he had to ask different teachers as well. Then he multiplied the amount of input by the amount of hours, and that would give you the amount of comprehensible input. And this is basically what Stephen Krashen calls comprehensible input. But he found that some students weren't getting as much comprehensible input as they should. So what was going on here? Well, they weren't doing it right. They were taking notes, trying to speak or thinking too much. So the equation had to be fine-tuned again. In order to implement the amount of damage that students had done by thinking or taking notes, you had to add in a new parameter for the damage. And in order to do this, he asked teachers to give their students a certain number. So students who were doing everything wrong would get a 60, and students who were doing everything right would get 100. And they had the possibility of becoming a native speaker. So now teachers had to turn in three things. First, the attendance of the students, the understanding, and the damage that was done. He also found that some students with a certain nationality tended to get better at the language faster because of similarities in culture and such. So he had to add that final parameter in as well. So now the final equation was done, and it was called LG for Automatic Language Growth Equation. Now, to be honest, actually two more parameters had to be added, one for teacher and one for situation, because not every teacher teaches the same way, so the experiences would be different. And for situation, well, for example, something that happened outside of class would be more memorable and thus would lead to better results than something in class. Now, I could talk more about this stuff, and I honestly would, but I feel like that would be too much. I do encourage you to read this book for yourself. I will put a link to it as well. But basically, I think you get the idea. This equation led to the method that we know now as automatic language growth, and it's still being used by this school, this class, although the school actually shut down, which I found out recently because I took one of those classes. So let me tell you about my experience. As you can probably tell, I'm kind of obsessed with all this acquisition stuff, and I really wanted to experience this for myself, as I have mentioned before. And I found out about this school actually a year ago, or maybe even longer, but only recently I started re-investigating again, and so I found this guy, Pablo Roman, the founder of Dreaming Spanish. And basically Dreaming Spanish is a method similar to this, but for people who are trying to learn Spanish. And so the founder of that website went to this school and he made a blog post about it, and I read that and I started getting interested in this. Now, before that, I told myself I was going to learn another language using the methods that Jeff Brown used. Now, this language would be Turkish, but it was kind of hard to find people to help me, whether it is Spanish or Turkish or Thai. All of these methods use the same theory, the same principles, so kind of overwhelmed and I'm not sure what to do, but I would have enjoyed listening to natives in Thai and actually visit these classes, but I found out that the school shut down due to COVID and most of the teachers have moved online, so I went to their website and I found that you could actually book one lesson, so I did that and I had that lesson. I had to wake up at 5 a.m. because it's Bangkok time and it's 5 hours ahead, but that's fine. It was really fun. I understood a lot actually, even though I have 0 hours of Thai. Everything was in Thai, but the teachers were just drawing and using gestures, and it was really fun. There were only like 4 other students, I think, or maybe 4 in total, but I really want to do more of these classes. Now, after those classes, I had a conversation with David Long, who is the coordinator of this Thai ALG program. Now, he told me that 3 or 4 hours is ideal if you don't want to lose the language after not using it for several months, because that's what he saw with his students. Sure, there were people who were doing it for more hours, like 5 or 6 hours a day, and they would actually improve after not being exposed to the language for several months. So I think 3 hours maybe would be a great way to start. Now, I think I could be doing like 1 hour of a class, like the class that I took. Additionally, I can use the YouTube videos that the teachers are making on YouTube, and then do 3 hours a day. And I'll keep you up to date to my progress. Maybe every 100 hours or so I can share my experience. So if you would like to see that, then well, let me know. And if you want to see more about this theory and why I feel like this has to work, it just makes sense, then you can check out this video.